Hey, what's going on guys? It's Ellyiot here and welcome back to another video. So in this video, I'm going to show you what MIDI controllers I use for iOS music production. Alright, so first up we got the Novation Launchkey Mini Mark III. So one of the main reasons why I picked up this MIDI controller is for its small and compact size. So it's small enough to fit within my studio setup and on my desk, and it's also small enough to toss in a backpack if I want to make music on the go. So some of the other reasons why I picked up this MIDI controller is because it has 16 pads, keys, 8 encoders, transport controls, pitch and modulation wheel, and also a socket for a sustain pedal. And basically, this was the only MIDI controller I could find within this size that had all those features. Now, keep in mind, my main intention to use this MIDI keyboard was to use it with BeatMaker 3. So I wanted the 16 pads because BeatMaker's drum machine has 16 pads. And then I'm okay with 25 keys. And then I wanted the 8 encoders because BeatMaker has 8 macro controls. And I wanted transport control so that I can control BeatMaker 3 without having to touch the iPad or touch my mouse. And I wanted a socket for a sustain pedal so I could use my sustain pedal along with this MIDI keyboard. And I'll get into another reason why I needed a socket for a sustain pedal. So as you can see, I have the 16 pads from the keyboard mapped to the 16 pads within BeatMaker. I got the 8 encoders mapped to the 8 macro controls. And then I also have the transport functions mapped to the transport functions within BeatMaker 3. So if I go over here to the pads, and then the transport controls, I have stop, play, and record. So here's play, stop, and then record. And I love having transport controls on a MIDI controller because I can pretty much, for the most part, do everything here within the MIDI keyboard without having to reach over for the iPad or the mouse. And then lastly, I have the 8 encoders mapped to the macro controls within BeatMaker 3. What I would have liked within this MIDI keyboard was probably some bigger pads, but I'm okay with using the smaller pads, and probably some endless encoders. But having regular encoders wasn't a huge deal breaker for me. I guess the comparable MIDI controller to this would be the Akai MPK Mini, which also has 25 keys, but it only has 8 pads, which are a little bit bigger, and it doesn't have transport controls, but it does have 8 encoders. It has some other features that this MIDI controller doesn't have, but those features didn't really appeal to me anyways, so I was willing to make that compromise. So as I was saying before, I use this MIDI controller with BeatMaker 3 since it's the main DAW that I use, but it works out perfect because of the 16 pads and the 8 encoders because of the 8 macro controls that you could use within BeatMaker 3. And if you watch some of my previous videos, you know that I like to use the macros within BeatMaker 3, so having at least 8 encoders was something I was looking for specifically within a MIDI keyboard. And if you're wondering about how the pads feel, I think they totally feel fine. They're not too hard and not too soft. They're kind of like in between. And I was looking at some other MIDI keyboards that had 16 pads, which were a little bit bigger, but then the size of the keyboard would have been much larger. So you can find this MIDI keyboard brand new anywhere between $100 to $150. You can buy it used for less than $100. So I actually picked up this controller secondhand and I picked it up for $60, and it was still in really great shape and it came with the original box. And that's another thing too, man. Like if you're in the market for some new gear and you're on a really tight budget, even if you're not on a tight budget, I would highly suggest and recommend to buy gear secondhand because you could find some really good deals out there if you're patient. And usually when you're buying gear secondhand, it's like half the price or even less. So yeah, as I said earlier, I really like this MIDI keyboard. I've been using it for a few years now, and I still haven't found anything similar within this size and price range. So if you're in the market for a new MIDI keyboard with similar features and size, I would highly recommend and suggest checking this out. All right, so up next is the Access 49 by c-thru Music. So just to give you a quick background about this MIDI controller, I believe it was originally released in 2009 or 2008, and then it got discontinued in 2012. And I believe it got discontinued because it didn't really do too well within the market. And to be honest, I think it didn't do too well because, in my opinion, at the time when this was released in 2008, 2009, this MIDI keyboard was way ahead of its time. I think people didn't really understand it back then and were kind of confused by it. So if this would have been released today, I think it would have made a bigger impact than it did back then. These MIDI controllers are super rare now, they're super hard to find. And once I first discovered and heard about this MIDI controller, I like scoured everywhere on the internet to find it. And it took me a while to try and find this MIDI controller. But lucky enough, I found one off of eBay and I bought it off some guy in the UK. And I believe I got it for about $400 Canadian. And I got this, I believe, in 2015. If you were to try and find this MIDI controller today, you would probably find it anywhere between 700 to 1,000. But the good thing is, in 2023, today, you do have a lot more options to find this secondhand. So you got reverb.com, Kijiji, Facebook Marketplace, eBay. Like there's a lot more places you'd be able to find this used online. But with that being said, they still are really, really hard to find. So I get asked about this MIDI controller all the time, like a lot. So when people ask me about it, it's kind of hard for me to explain what exactly it is, because even for myself, I'm still trying to fully grasp and understand this MIDI keyboard. So basically, this is an isomorphic keyboard and it's based off of the harmonic table. But if you just Google it, you'll find a ton of information online regarding isomorphic keyboards and harmonic tables. So it's 98 buttons in total, and then you also have 2 buttons over here, which just changes the octave. So this MIDI keyboard isn't any different from a traditional keyboard. It's just the way you play is different. So basically the way you play on this MIDI keyboard is by shapes. So when you play certain shapes, it plays a chord, which consists of you holding down either like 3, 2, or 4 buttons. It'll play a chord. A cool thing about this layout is if I play a specific chord slash shape like this, if I were to play that exact same chord slash shape anywhere else within the MIDI keyboard, it's going to play that same chord, but just at a different key. And another benefit with this MIDI keyboard is on your traditional keyboard, if you were to play 5 keys, you would have to like stretch out your hand super far to play 5 keys at the same time. Depending on what the chord is, you might have to stretch out your fingers like really far apart, or maybe even use 2 hands. But with this MIDI keyboard, because the buttons are so small and because they're so close together, it's easy to play chords with one hand because they're literally all right beside each other and they're not so far to reach. So if I were to play 5 keys, I could just do that all with one hand. Now, is this keyboard easier to play than a traditional keyboard? Yes and no. It's different for every person. For me, it's easier to play on this than a traditional keyboard because I have met some people who are really good on the keys, and then when they try to play on this, they're just kind of like, what the fuck is this? Like, what do I do with this? Like, I don't get it or whatever, right? So they have a more difficult time playing on this because they find it easier to play with a traditional keyboard. But on the flip side, I have met some other people too who are really good on the keys, and then when they play on this, they're like completely blown away. They're like, oh my God, this is crazy. The way that this is laid out and how all the buttons are so small and close together, it just opened up the door for so many more possibilities for chords and different progressions and things like that. But for whatever reason, it's just easy for me to see the shapes and to play the shapes. Because on a traditional keyboard, you can't really picture shapes or whatever when you're playing the keys. But within the whole isomorphic keyboard realm, there's so many different layouts for this style of playing. So if you didn't know, and if you do want to try this, there actually is an app version of this. And you guys have probably seen it in my videos, and that's called Music's Pro. So here is the app version of this MIDI keyboard. So if you're ever curious about trying out this MIDI keyboard, you can basically try the app version, which is pretty sick because if I'm making music on the go, sometimes I don't even need to bring any MIDI controllers. I basically just have my iPad and I rock this with BeatMaker 3. Getting the app version might actually be even better than getting the hardware version because the app version has a lot more advantages compared to the hardware version. Because in the settings, you can go and choose all the different layouts. These are all different layouts that are commonly used within the isomorphic keyboard world or whatever. See, if you click on that, it gives you all different layouts. And basically, they're all just different ways of playing the keys because all the keys are laid out different. And what's cool is I have seen people mod this MIDI keyboard so that they can have a layout such as like Wiki Hayden or Park. So yeah, definitely check out Music's Pro if you're really curious to see what this MIDI keyboard is all about. But yeah, I really love this MIDI keyboard because it allows me to play in a way that I wouldn't normally play on a traditional keyboard. It actually pretty much opened up the door for me to learn more about music theory and isomorphic keyboards and the harmonic table and all that. It's really interesting for sure, and it can be super confusing. But if that's something you're into, if you're really into chords and like chord progression, then yeah, check it out. Now, some of you might be saying, like, oh, there's so many other chord apps out there. The reason why I like this and Music's Pro is because you're actually playing. With some of the other apps, you have to do a lot of programming. So you have to program your chords and all of that. But for me, for myself, when I'm playing, I like to do the least amount of programming as much as possible. And I like to try and play out things as much as I can because I feel like it gives you more of like a human feel when you're making music and all that. With that being said, you can still program, music, drums, chords, and all that and still give it that human feel. But for myself personally, I love to just play and like touch a keyboard and have it come out exactly the way I played it. And another cool thing about this MIDI keyboard is also its small and compact size. So as you can see here, I can fit both my MIDI keyboards on the table and I could slide it in and slide it out. And another thing, coming back to what I was talking about before with this MIDI keyboard and the sustain jack. So this MIDI keyboard, the Access 49, doesn't have a socket for a sustain pedal, but since this one does, and since both of these are hooked up to my iPad, so I could use the sustain from this on this MIDI keyboard, which is pretty dope. All right, so I'm gonna just play around just to give you an example. All right, let's get some drums going here. But yes, once again, this is my most prized possession, my most favorite MIDI keyboard I've ever owned. I'm never getting rid of it. If you can get your hands on one, I highly suggest picking it up or checking it out. But in the meantime, if you're already rocking on the iPad, go check out the app Music's Pro, which is essentially the exact same thing as the hardware version, but you could try all the different layouts within the app and play keys in a different way that you've never played before and open up the door for more possibilities. So check it out. All right, up next is the Arturia BeatStep. And I specifically got this MIDI controller because, once again, I wanted something that was small enough to fit within my setup. As you can see here, all three MIDI keyboards easily fit within my table. And it's also small enough to toss in a backpack if I want to make music on the go. 16 pads, which all light up. You also have 16 encoders, which are all endless encoders. Then you still also have transport functions over here on the left side. Now, there are a bunch of other features within this MIDI controller. Those features didn't really appeal to me, so I'm not going to really touch on that. But for the most part, all I wanted was 16 pads, 16 endless encoders, and transport functions. But I pretty much got this MIDI controller to do like live performance stuff. I do use this with BeatMaker and other DAWs, but I really like to use this with AUM and Fly Tape 2. So similar to BeatMaker 3, within AUM, you can save different MIDI templates for all your different MIDI controllers. And you could also save sessions. So you can have like a whole bunch of stuff laid out here within AUM and then save it as a session. So then when you go back to load the session, everything comes back exactly how it was. So within this session, let me show you how I have it set up with the MIDI controller. So as you can see here, I have two instances of fly tape. Let me just pull up the one instance first. So for the first instance of fly tape, as you can see within fly tape, there's 8 different effects. So I have this half or this section of the MIDI keyboard that controls the effects on fly tape. So speed, saturation, mute, reverse, speed, saturation, mute, reverse. Then you got warble, lo-fi, break, and stutter. And then over here, I have warble, lo-fi, break, and stutter. So all the effects that's on Flytape 2 is on all the pads here. And then for the encoders, as you can see within Flytape 2, some of the effects, not all, but some of the effects have different variations of the effect. As I said earlier, I have stutter here on my bottom pad, and on this encoder, this changes the variation of the stutter effect. So as you can see, if I turn my knob here, I can select which variation I want for stutter. So as you can see with lo-fi, this encoder over here changes the variation of the lo-fi effect. And up above saturation, the above parameter will change the variation of the effect for saturation. Now you're probably wondering, why do I have a second instance of Flytape 2? So let me open up both now. So basically I had this half right here on the MIDI controller to control this instance of Flytape. On the second instance of Flytape 2, I have this half or this side of the MIDI controller controlling the second instance of Flytape 2. So basically all I did was set a different variation for each Flytape. So for example, again, this lo-fi has lo-fi 1, and this lo-fi has lo-fi 4. This break has the car. This break has the rabbit. So it just gives you a lot more flexibility if you want to do live performance stuff. So let me show you a quick example using the different variations of effects on this MIDI keyboard. If you wanted to, you could even combine 2 effects at once. Now you obviously wouldn't combine 2 stutters, but you could combine 2 lo-fi effects. So let's try that out. So yeah, this is a really dope MIDI controller, especially if you're going to be using it for like live performances, which is the exact reason why I got it. And it's really good to use with AUM because you have a lot of different configuration options in regards to MIDI. Oh, and another thing I forgot to mention, within Flytape 2's effects, as you can see, some of them don't have different variations for the specific effect. So what I did with the MIDI controller was, for these 2 encoders, I assigned noise to one and then mix to the other one. Yeah, I think in a future video, I'll probably do like a video, like a live performance thing where I'm using this setup and maybe using some of the other MIDI controllers, but specifically doing something with this MIDI controller and using like Flytape and some other cool effects apps. So keep an eye out for that. But if you're in the market for this, I think it's similar priced as the Novation Launchkey Mini. I think it goes anywhere between $100 and $150. But if you buy it from the used market, you can find it a lot cheaper for less than $100. Once again, I bought this used. I got this for, I believe, $50. Yeah, I got this from $50. And I didn't buy it from someone locally. I actually got it from a local guitar center and found a good deal on it. Once again, you got the 16 pads, 16 endless encoders, and transport controls, which is huge. So really good for live performance stuff and even using it just to create in general. Yeah, once again, you can buy brand new, but I highly suggest buying it secondhand if you can find a good deal. So yeah, definitely go and check that out. So that about wraps it up for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed that or found it helpful. Let me know if you guys have any of these MIDI controllers and what you think of them. And also drop a comment below and let me know which MIDI controllers you use for iOS music production. All right, y'all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.